Okay guys, a long video awaits us. Time to start making it. How are you typing?
What do you mean?
Your flork doesn't have ends.
Touché.
Anyway, I was asked to introduce the guardsmen of the trailer. So I summoned you because people were very curious about you. Can you tell us your name? Great, can you tell us a bit about yourself? Thank you for your introduction. I will snap if I need you.
I didn't understand a single thing he said.
You don't speak Old Kata-chan? He said his name is Joy, his hobby is singing, and he works in this theater from 3 years.
You got all that from his screaming? And anyway, if 3 snaps make him attack and 1 summons him, what do 2 snaps do?
That is to require assistance.
And 4?
You don't want to know what happens if I snap 4 times. Pray to the Emperor I never have to do so, that you never have to see the horrors that would awaken. So Pio, ready to learn even more 40k lore against your own will?
Do I have a choice?
No. We will go back at the time of the Great Crusade to talk about one of the most obscure conflicts that happened during it and solve a mystery that unfolded in it. The Imperium is a fragile sliver of sanity in the void, besieged upon all sides by forces of monstrous dread that are held at bay only by the blood and sacrifice of millions of forgotten heroes. For every crusade trumpeted to the masses as a safe legacy of triumph and glory, like the much-lauded victory at Ullanor, there are 100 dire tales of desperate stalemate with forces malignant beyond mortal ken. Were the populace of the Imperium to realize the dire peril in which they existed in the tenuous days of the Great Crusade, then it is likely that the terror would have kept them prisoners on old Earth, never to reach out for the stars. Of all these hidden threats and dire wars against the unknown, the most infamous among scholars of the Forbidden is that of the Rangdan campaigns. But before solving the mystery, we need to introduce who the Rangdan are and what the Rangdan Xenocides and campaigns against them were for the Imperium of Men.
What the hell is a Rangda, by the way?
That is one of the neat parts. Nobody knows what a Rangda itself is, nobody knows what they look like or who they precisely served. They are even theorized to be a slave race of my favorite Xeno species in 40k, the not so originally titled Sloth.
Are they called like that after the word slaughter?
Yeah, as you can see, not really original.
It will be like calling the Primarch of a legion called the Iron Hands Ferus Manus and make his hands made of iron.
How many times I told you, Pio, don't bully the Iron Hands fans. There are 2 of them, and their lore is punishment enough. The first encounter between the Rangdan race and the Imperium of Men happened in 839 M30, and before people get confused, we are using military dates. That means that M30 is from the year 29,001 to 30,000, and M31 is from 30,001 to 31,000, so nobody gets confused by the dates later on. An expedition of the 5th Legion, the White Scars, made contact with the race known as the Rangda in 839 M30, in the system of Advex Morse, located at the galactic northeast of the galaxy, most probably near the Ghoul Stars, seeing as it was almost at the border of the galaxy.
Where the fuck is North in space?
The reports of the White Scars 105th Pioneer Company painted a very grim picture of what Advex Morse was. 6 worlds constituted the system of Advex Morse, and they were all super heavily fortified and garrisoned. Even the Division Militaris of the Imperium, seeing the amount of forces amassed at Advex Morse, would mistakenly conclude that Advex Morse was the seat of power of the Rangdan Empire. The First Legion was the one that received the report of the forces of the Rangdan at Advex Morse, and started amassing a mighty armada to go and conquer the Rangdan. 50,000 Space Marines of the Dark Angels were present, another 100,000 support troops joined the forces of the Dark Angels too, both from the Imperial Army and the Mechanicum Tagmata forces of a nearby Forge world recently brought to compliance, Xana. The Legion at this time was led by Grandmaster Urian Vendraig, that amassed as the leading squadron of its fleet nothing less than 3 Gloriana-class battleships, the Invincible Reason that during the Great Crusade was the flagship of the Dark Angels, the Paradigm of 8 and the Truth's Razor. These were supported also by almost 100 capital-class starships of the Imperium of Men, and many times that smaller escort crafts. It was also observed by the explorators that the Rangdan had vast legions of captured humans and Xenos races on various of their defensive bulwarks, slave soldiers bound to the Rangdan masters by neural collars that enforced absolute loyalty, and made of them nothing less than savage drones to the Rangdan that were commanding them. The Rangda instead possessed many horrific weapons, products of vile technology created solely for destruction and subjugation, and their symbol of supremacy in the system was a massive war moon that was sitting in orbit of Advex Mors Primus, the capital planet of the system. This engine of war had the firepower of a full fleet of starships, and bore armor capable of shrugging off capital-scale starship weaponry. It would be the biggest obstacle in the conquest of Advex Mors.
And the Dark Angels, seeing all those fortifications and forces of the Rangdan in the system, chose the best way to attack, I hope.
Surely they did. They chose the best way to attack the Rangdan that was the least risky one. Full-blown frontal assault. The fleet of Grandmaster Yuran Vendrake translated into the system as a single wedge of steel and guns, facing just a few scattered squadrons of Rangdan warp Borgs as resistance when they appeared, and they were quickly destroyed by the fleet that had invaded the Rangdan territory. The invasion started with the Grandmaster himself assaulting at the head of the First Legion's 8th chapter, the planet of Advex Mors Extremis. 1,000 warriors of the Dark Angels deployed on the planet against 10,000 enemies that were nothing more than frenzied flesh puppets, slaves of the Rangdan Overlord. They were being thrown against the Astartes to try and slow them down. The battle lasted only 3 hours, and the Dark Angels lost 200 marines in the assault, with Urian Vendrake himself killing the Rangdan Overlord in the mines of the planet. And the same kind of situation repeated for another 4 worlds in the system, skirmishes with slave armies of humans and various Xenos controlled by the Rangdan that were bleeding the First Legion, while only a few Rangdans were slain in the assault. Within a few months, the 4 outmost planets were in control of the Imperium, that now was aiming at Advex Mors Primus. The true battle would be fought here, because while the Dark Angels were subjugating the other planets, the Rangda had regrouped and gathered their forces in their huge shielded fortresses on Advex Mors Primus. Here Vendrake realized an assault on the planet or on the War Moon would turn into a war of attrition and bleed the First Legion even more, so he decided on a more daring plan. He would strike the planet and the War Moon at the same time, in the hope of conquering both. When the assault started, in the first few moments, so many guns fired at once that many hundreds of crafts of both sides were destroyed. A flotilla had formed a cordon around the War Moon and was making landing impossible. In turn, they were defending the planet with guns that were ripping apart the First Legion assault fleet. It will be with the sacrifice of the Gloriana-class battleship Paradigm of 8 that the tide of the engagement will finally turn. It plowed through the flotilla of the Rangda, and while under heavy fire, slammed directly into the side of the War Moon. The survivors on the surface taking defensive position while they faced the Rangda warriors for the first time. A match for the Legionis Astartes. Both sides suffered extreme losses in the battle, but in the end they could not overwhelm the survivors, that had the time to overload the Gloriana-class battleship plasma reactor, that in exploding created a miniature sun that crippled the War Moon and spread a deadly storm of debris across the orbit of the planet.
Why is it a standard Imperial tactic to throw irreplaceable ships and technology at the enemy literally to win?
I think it is part of the basic manual of every officer at this point to do this if things get dire. It will explain why it happens so many times across so many different wars. With the War Moon silenced, the remaining 2 Gloriana-class battleships assaulted the planet directly. A rain of drop pods fell on it away from its fortresses, as smaller squadrons were sent to buy time for the rest of the landing forces on the surface with Stormbird transports and gunships. These forces will see action first, fighting and killing the slave soldiers sent to investigate their landing zones. For the first day of the invasion, the majority of the fighting was weathered by the Order of Crows of the First Legion and the Marshals of the Hosts of Wind and Fire. First they had to fight only slave forces of the Rangdan that were bleeding them in the wake of the Rangdan assault. They in fact will be the first to face the true Rangda in combat, and for this I requested the help of Giulio Ragusa, an Italian voice actor in training that offered to me his help for the videos, and he will help me narrate some parts of the story.
Little is known of the enemy those warriors faced. That they were towering creatures of fell strength, inhuman cunning, and bearing the products of a cruel technology that equaled or even exceeded that of mankind is common to all the tales that will later be told. The warriors that fought these initial battles suffered terribly, many of the columns reduced to less than half their original strength as they fended off the Rangdan, and several were annihilated entirely, but the information they procured was priceless indeed. The tactics, weaponry and character of the Rangdan were laid bare to Grandmaster Vendrake, though at the cost of several hundreds of his finest warriors, and with this, he planned his next steps.
From that point, things started moving quickly. Grandmaster Vendrake decided to use the weakness of the Rangdan immediately. A host of 30,000 Legiones Astartes in full panoply of war and with all the brutal weapons of their trade, pretty much all the combat-capable left Space Marines of the Dark Angels that were not bound to fight in orbit aboard the ships of the fleet, advanced to meet their enemy once and for all. Such a force couldn't be ignored by the Rangdan echelons on the planet, proud and certain of their own superiority. They quickly moved to oppose the First Legion that had dared to invade their home. The two armies met across a 100 km battlefield of Advex Morse, made of broken outlands. The first stages of the battle were fought once again against the Slave Legion of the Rangdan, but the Grandmaster knew of the Rangdan tactics by this point, and instead of waiting for the Rangdan to expend the lives of their slaves on the blades of his brothers to find a weak link in their defensive line, he decided to strike first, leading a charge that burst through the slave soldier battalions and attacked directly the waiting Rangdan overlords. The melee that resulted from this assault was brutal for both sides, but the Rangdan were too proud to retreat in the face of such a challenge. Giulio can take it from here once again.
Legions Astartes warriors were cut asunder by Rangdan warriors, enveloped in layers of energy shielding that burned the very air about them as they fought, while the lithe, vulpine Xenos fell before the tyrannic greatswords of the First Legion Terminators. It was a slaughter that would have ended in mutual annihilation, both sides equally matched in skill and power, until Vendrake met the Rangdan War Master in single combat. Vendrake was a superlative swordsman, strong of arm and swift in battle, yet his foe was a towering monster cloaked in burning energy fields and wielding a huge crystalline blade that bled a neurotoxin of hideous potency. For an hour the duel raged, and, as their warriors died around them, the two generals fought with savage ferocity, neither giving an inch. In the end, though racked by the pain of the toxin raging in his blood, and his armor rent and sundered, Urian Vendrake slew his foe and held high the severed head of the Rangdan War Master. The battle decided, and the pride of that foul Xenos breed broken.
With the death of their War Master, the forces of the Rangdan scattered, now a broken force of disorganized soldiers. The next months were spent in siege after siege to bring down their fortresses and cleanse the planet and its war moon from the taint and general presence of every Rangdan remaining, until all of them were annihilated and the First Legion triumphed, but it was a bloody victory. It is estimated that some 10,000 Space Marines of the First Legion were slain in combat and active duty. 50 ships of the main line of the fleet were completely destroyed, including the Paradigm of 8, an irreplaceable Gloriana-class battleship.
I mean, I wouldn't really blame the Rangdan for that. I would say that if they stopped throwing irreplaceable ships at the enemy like Blackstone fortresses on Cadia, they would not lose them as often.
I mean, I agree, but that is beside the point. Consider that this was the first campaign against the Rangdan, and with a force so massive they still lost so many marines and battleships. It was a victory suffered in the blood of chapters, not even companies. This is just to explain what kind of enemy the Imperium was facing.
Yes, but this was the end of it, was it?
I mean, they are called the Rangdan Xenocides for a reason. This was the first, there were 3 in total. The second Rangdan campaign was fought in 862 M30. Keep this in mind, we will come back to it later. When the Rangdans returned, the Imperium realized that Advex Morse was not the center of their empire, because they didn't arrive with a small fleet, but with a vast armada comprising thousands of vessels and a dozen war moons. A force of might that was completely unexpected and far exceeding the projected strength of any attack that could come from that side of the galaxy. They struck the northern fringes of the Imperium, annihilating all fleets set in defense of it, and forced all the colonists of the planet they were conquering into neural shackles, making them war slaves. It was only thanks to the efforts of expeditionary fleets under the banners of the White Scars and the Raven Guard that time would be bought for Imperial forces to rally and counterattack the invasion force, but the price for that respite was staggering.
At the isolated Forge World of Xena, the combined forces of the 5th and 19th Legions fought a bitter holding action for 8 months, at a cost of 3,000 of the Legiones Astartes and many hundreds of thousands of Mechanicum Thralls. The siege of Xena would be broken by the furious onslaught of the Dark Angels and Death Guard, shattering the Rangdan blockade and cutting a path through the slave cohorts on the surface, to once again open up the Forge as a beachhead for the Imperium's counterattacks.
Thanks for the help, Giulio, that will be everything, but I just realized something. You are an Italian living in Australia, and I never heard of you burning down pizzerias there to get vengeance for pineapple pizza, so I declare you excommunicate traitoris and banish you to oblivion for it.
I actually like pineapple pizza.
Following the siege of Xana, the war went on for more than 2 decades. Millions upon millions of deaths were suffered by the Imperium. 19 inhabited systems lay to waste, and a ban on further expedition past the exclusive post of Endris and Morox was put in place. During the war, contingents of 9 separate legions would become embroiled in the fighting, more than 300,000 space marines being deployed at the height of the conflict, with 3 Primarchs that led their own legions in battle against the Rangda, with the main honor to being the foremost commander of the Second Rangdan War given to Lionel Johnson of the Dark Angels.
Seemed like a desperate struggle for survival.
Even more than you might think, Pio. When the last expeditionary fleet had breached the eastern fringes of the galaxy, in doing so they had attracted the attention of the Rangdan Serapvors, a species of macabre power and technological might. It seemed that the Imperium was going to meet its end here. Entire expeditionary fleets went to their deaths without a single survivor. Worlds were laid to waste, dozens of Titan legions were obliterated by the end of the war, and it was even said that entire legions of space marines met their end there. To win this war, the Emperor had to break open the Labyrinth of Night.
The Labyrinth of Night, what is that?
Are you a Mechanicus fan, Pio?
Yes, why?
Then you know it under another name, the Noctis Labyrinth.
How did you do that? We are indoors.
The Emperor had to break open the prison of a Catan shard of the Void Dragon, the Omnisaya of the Mechanicus, and threw him against the Rangdan to try and make the Imperium win the war. This was the move that in the end made the Imperium survive the Second Rangdan campaign.
So the Emperor used the Void Dragon as a Pokemon against the Rangdan. Got it.
And not only that, the Rangdan brought with them some kind of taint that could infect humans and alike. It took decades of bioprograms for the Rangdan taint to be purged from the systems they had assaulted and invaded, and that left entire human-inhabited sectors as lifeless husks. The Dark Angels and the Space Wolves were entrusted to undertake this purging of the Rangdan taint that had infected so many worlds. Imagine that the Dark Angels alone lost so many Marines in the conflict that they were surpassed as the biggest legion of Marines by the Ultramarines. The losses they suffered, a wound they will never recover from. Then the conflict was swept under the rug. All records of it sealed with the last copies given to the Dark Angels for safekeeping. The veterans that have fought and survived the war either mind-wiped or eliminated altogether. The planets left barren by the Rangdan War and Taint were simply abandoned, and then the Remembrancers brought in to make up an half-fax, half-fiction tale of the Xenocides to feed the Imperium. Because the Emperor thought that the only way for the Imperium to rebuild after the second Xenocide was for the Rangda to vanish from all existence and history, and for humanity to never learn about how near their extinction they came from the war they had just fought.
So that leaves the third Rangdan Xenocide.
Yes, and believe it or not, it is the less brutal of the 3. This is canonically the only event of the 3 known as the Xenocide, because it signed the end of the Rangdan, at least until the recent time of the Imperium. They haven't returned since. The third Rangdan Xenocide is a very little known tale in the Imperium of Men. It was conducted under the orders of the Division Militaris, by the combined forces of the Dark Angels and the Space Wolves. The race of the Rangdan had been sorely wounded by their second war with the Imperium. They had returned to their ancient homeworlds to lick their wounds, and there, with their dark hunger for vengeance against the Imperium, they were growing strong once again. In 887 M30, a fleet of White Scars exploring space after the lifting of the Edict of Exclusion found the nest of the Rangdan completely by chance. The news the Sons of Jagatai Khan had brought to the table of the Lion and the Wolf made these two antagonistic Primarchs unite in the same bleak purpose, because if the Rangdan still lived, they must be destroyed lest they rise again and ignite another great war.
So the Lion and the Wolf pretty much went fuck the Rangdan in particular and united just to kill them.
A common enemy can unite even the most hateful of brothers of the same species. They reached the home of the Rangdan and laid waste to it from orbit with Exterminatus level weaponry, just to descend to verify the termination of every hive and fortress left standing with flame and blade. Don't get me wrong, this was no war to be spoken of, this was a one-sided extermination. Even Russ and the Lion knew to not have any illusions of chivalry and glory. All they had was the satisfaction in the utter annihilation of every single warrior and worker of the Rangdan breed that was left breathing. Of the once hideously populated and built world of the Rangdan, now only plains of fractured glass left by atomic fire existed. This world would become home to the Order of the Broken Claws of the Dark Angels, a force left there as keepers of the last set of codices detailing the Rangdans and their weaknesses, and to stand watch in case any of their cursed breed of Xenos ever returned again. This was the end of the Rangdan and their wars.
Wait though, the title of the video says that you solved the mystery of the 2 missing Primarchs. You didn't even mention them at all while talking of the Rangdan.
Don't worry, Pio, now is the time. My research on the topic and my knowledge in general of 40k has brought me to solve the mystery of the two missing Primarchs. They are connected to the Xenocides, and so is their common end. This will be a more serious part of the video, but know that everything I'm going to say here is personal speculation, not to be taken as confirmed lore, but it is very well researched and theorized, and I haven't found any elements of it that go against the solution to the mystery I found and will now explain. You will have to bear with me though, because it isn't a straightforward answer, but it is certainly a complete one. But let me start with two premises. First, I made and posted this meme about how every other lore YouTuber was wrong on this topic. Mind you, this isn't an attack on any of them, nor saying that their videos are bad or their lore unreliable. All lore channels just repeat what is written around and put it in order for easy understanding in compact pills, we could say. But this meme wanted to signify that in my personal opinion, all of them misinterpreted the events that brought to the end of the two missing Primarchs, because the answers I got from many videos after watching them don't match the story and interpretation I have given to them after becoming a veteran of this universe. And second, for this part of the video I will use the already heavily hated official wiki of 40k on the missing Primarchs. Mind though, I made my research very carefully. The only reason I'm using the official wiki is because it compiles all info I need for my explanation in one single place, making the editing and narrating process of the video a lot less stressful and making the video and my answer to this mystery easier to understand. So, time to dive in. Now, you have to understand something. My brain is pretty much always high on ADHD. It is always in motion, connecting information and noticing connections in everything. It is what brought me to dive into the Rangdan Xenocide a lot more seriously than I had before. I was familiar with the Xenocide like the majority of other lore I know, but when I heard there was a possible connection to one of the missing Primarchs, I decided that it was time to put my brain to the challenge, and see if I could solve the mystery of one of them. By the end of my madness-fueled research into the entire topic, I had solved the mystery of both of them, and it all started here, at the sources used for the Rangdan Xenocide for the Lexicanum page that talks of it. For anybody interested, all sources I'm using for this video will be in the description, but the majority of them are on screen now. Don't mind the censored one, we will talk about it in a minute. Before, a little funny story, about the source of White Dwarf 470. I went back and recovered all the sources listed here to go and read them to find out more about what happened, but for the life of me when I reached White Dwarf 470 page 101, I couldn't find anything relating to the missing Primarchs or the Rangdan in general. Like, are the Rangdan mentioned here? If so, where? I even went as far as to use the research command on my PDF reading app just to see if I was blind or something, but no, the Rangdans are not even mentioned here in any page, until I looked closely and read that it talked about the Battle of Advex Mors of the Horus Heresy. So I went and read about that, to see what that had to do with the Rangdans in general, just to find out that the entire connection to this source is that some chroniclers of the Horus Heresy inadvertently misidentified Advex Mors as the old homeworld of the Rangda after the Horus Heresy.
You were being trolled by two wikis, an official piece of White Dwarf, and the lore in general for a mistake that written characters made inside the lore?
Exactly, I was being trolled from the 40k universe in general, and on the funny tangent that sent me crazy for an entire day for a connection that wasn't even there in the first place. Thank you, Lexicanum! So, after doing all of my research on these sources, I couldn't find any connection to the missing Primarchs or their legions in general being there during the Rangdan Xenocide. Now keep in mind, we know that the first campaign was fought only by the Dark Angels, and the last one was an extermination campaign fought by the Dark Angels and the Space Wolves. That leaves that the only campaign they could have taken part in was the second one, the biggest war against the Rangdan, and the one that mentions that legions, plural, were destroyed during the war. But that was not enough to prove the legions or their Primarchs had anything to do with it. So I moved to the page and the sources of the Rangdan race, always on Lexicanum, and went and read all of them. Still, no connection to it, and White Dwarf 470 was here too, fucking troll of an article. And then, I noticed something. I went back to the page of the Xenocides to see if I had missed anything, and I noticed that I didn't check one of the sources. Maybe my brain told me it makes so little sense that a connection will be there that I shouldn't be bothered looking for it. But my brain also always tells me that details are the most important part of research. So I went and found the source cited as the Regimental Standard, field dressing a Lasgun wound. Don't think, I too was thinking, what in the Emperor has this to do with the Rangdans? Clicking on it brought me to a page saved on the Wayback Machine of a site called the Regimental Standard. As the site says it, required weekly reading for modern guardsmen. And I read the article. And I saw the picture with it. Now, the article doesn't offer much insight, just that a mistake in printing was made during the creation of the primer pages on field dressing a Lasgun wound. Mistake that was corrected by taping the instructions on the wrong page. But the wrong page has the title The Rangdan Xenocides, a Crusade Field Guide. Let's read it together, let's see if you catch when my brain made the connection that created this video. Greetings, Solar Auxilia. The time has come to spread the light of Imperial truth to another corner of the galaxy. In this campaign you will be receiving Legiones Astartes support from none other than the renowned warriors of the 2nd and 11 Legions, better known as the... This was the connection I was looking for, proof that the two missing legions and maybe even their Primarchs fought in the second Rangdan Xenocides. How do we know it is the second? As I explained, the first was only Dark Angels, and the last was only Dark Angels and Space Wolves. The second saw forces of 9 different legions and 3 Primarchs fighting it, and was the only one that could have had Solar Auxilia auxiliaries in it, because the first war was fought only by the auxiliaries of the Imperial Army and Xana, and the last was probably an Astartes-only mission of extermination. So we know where we have to look. Something happened during the second Rangdan campaign. From here, it was all a descent into madness. That solved this mystery for me thanks to many details I saw while researching the general mentions of the missing Primarchs. You even have to keep in mind a random comment that Fulgrim made. Fulgrim said to have known the Primarch of the 2nd Legion, but that the 11th was a complete mystery. Keep this in mind because this too will be useful later. Let's start with their designations, the Forgotten and the Purged. Now, these names never made sense in my mind. If you want something deleted and nobody to look into it, you must make it seem almost like looking into it is a crime by itself. It is why the Traitor Primarchs are called either that or the Chaos Primarchs. Their names inspire hate. The Forgotten and the Purged do not. And in my mind that doesn't make sense for a propaganda machine that was them gone from the history of the galaxy. And also, this name put an idea in my mind. One was purged, that means he was killed by somebody of the Imperium. But the Forgotten, why is he called that? If he is deleted from the Imperium, he is already forgotten. Even the Purged is forgotten. Why is he called the Forgotten in the first place? Keep this in mind too, we will come to it shortly. The biggest mistake that I've seen all other lore tubers of 40k make is that they think the missing Primarchs, or at least one of them, went traitors. But I don't think that is the case at all. If we look at what Rogal Dorn said in the Falls of the Katmandau Precinct, he comments that no one ever spoke of those two absent brothers. Their separate tragedies had seemed like aberrations. Had they in fact been warnings that no one had heeded? He's not mentioning betrayal, he's mentioning tragedies. We even get useful insight about it from the conversation between the word-bearers of the Gal Vorbak of the Serrated Sun chapter. But the 11th Legion is expunged from Imperial records for good reason, as is the 2nd. I'm not saying I don't feel temptation creeping over me, brother, a single sword thrust piercing that pod, and without right a shameful future, and deny the Ultramarines a significant boost in recruitment numbers. What? What? You were thinking it too, it's no secret. Those are just rumors. Perhaps, perhaps not. The 13th definitely swelled to eclipse all other legions around the time the 2nd and the 11th were forgotten by Imperial archives. For those who don't get it, the 13th is the Ultramarines, and if you remember earlier in the video, they ended up surpassing in numbers the Dark Angels during the second Rangdan Xenocide, both for the losses of the Dark Angels in the war, but also, almost unnaturally, for a very high number of recruits joining their ranks. Going forward instead, we get a conversation between Casper Hauser and Liman Russ during the massacre of the entire population of the planet of Genna, where the Space Wolves had been sent to bring the World Eaters to heel. There is a first time for everything. Exactly. The unprecedented. Like Astartes fighting Astartes, like the route being called to sanction another legion. That... Hyolda. No, that's not unprecedented. The Space Wolves were the Emperor's executioners. They fought another legion. Fighting other Astartes was not a problem for them, because by that point, they had done it before. During the second Rangdan Xenocide. Keep this in mind, we're almost at the answer. Now, there is other sources on this page that talk about the missing Primarchs in various tones, like they were both purged by the Emperor, like their Primarchs were at fault where the legions weren't. But I can say that seeing so much conflicting information makes me think that nobody actually knows the truth. They are just speculating like we are now, but there is strong indicators of where the truth lies. but we have to deal with a small problem first. The only claim on this page that goes against what I found, but I can prove that it is either a writing mistake or misinformation given by propaganda. The claim I'm talking about is in the canon conflicts of this wiki page. Ignoring the part where in the second edition the missing legions and Primarchs fought on the side of Horus at the beginning of the Heresy, we have the retcon that happens in the first Heretic by Aaron Dembski-Bowden, where a conversation between Magnus the Red and Lorgar takes place about the two missing Primarchs and the deaths of their legions. And there is a comment that it happened 43 standard years before the Dropside massacre of Isstvan V, but this claim makes no sense for a number of reasons. This will place it too late for their purges to have happened during the second Rangdan Xenocide. The wars against the Rangdans ended in 887 M30. Now, when the Dropside massacre took place is still debated. It was either in 005 M31 or 006 M31. But if the purges happened 43 years before, that would place them in 962 M30. This date is too close to the Horus Heresy and too late after the creation of the Remembrancers to make it possible to purge two Primarchs and their legions from history entirely. Simply too many people would have known about it. And there is something else. There is a conversation in the novel Deliverance Lost between Corvus Corax, Primarch of the Raven Guard, and the Emperor of Mankind during his first ever meeting with the Emperor, where they talk about the other Primarchs after Corax was rediscovered. Yes, you are brothers. 17 of them. You are the Primarchs, my finest creations. 17? I remember that I was number 19. How can that be so? The Emperor's expression grew bleak, filled with deep sorrow. He looked away as he replied. The other two, that is a conversation for another day. Now, I want you to notice that he talks of the missing Primarchs with grief the Emperor rarely showed for anything else. If a family member betrays you, you remember them with hate if you can't forgive that betrayal to the point of purging them entirely. But the Emperor feels grief, almost as if there was nothing he could do to save his own sons. The best estimate of when Corax was discovered, seeing the sources and mentions in other books, is 952 M30, 10 years before the purge took place by word of Lorgar and Magnus, and yet the Primarchs are already purged in this conversation. Then I noticed something else. The date Lorgar and Magnus give is 962 M30. The date of the beginning of the second Rangdan campaign is 862 M30, exactly a century before the estimate they give. This makes me think that either Lorgar and Magnus weren't there during the Xenocide and were fed propaganda by the Emperor and the Remembrancers, or that the fact that the first Heretic came out in 2010 and the 9th Black Book of the Horus Heresy where the Xenocides are detailed came out in 2020 is connected to it. They are written by different people that can't ever know everything about 40k one side or the other writes, or the 9th book of the Horus Heresy is soft retconning the claim of an exact century to make it make sense in the lore of 40k for such a catastrophic war that nobody knows anything about. And here we are. This is where everything for me was pieced together. I will give you the answers to what happened to the 2nd and 11 legions and their missing Primarchs, and why they were deleted from Imperial records. Let's start from the 2nd. Fulgrim admitted to have known the Primarch of the 2nd. That means that he was with his legion when he deployed against the Rangdan during the second Rangdan campaign. Now, from what I said earlier and how it was explained, we know that the Rangdan took prisoners and slaves with mind-controlling collars to fight in their wars pretty much as slave drones of the Rangdan Empire. And not only that, but that they brought with them pretty much a taint or a disease that the Imperium couldn't counter. They had to purge and burn it down until it was finally gone for good. So what I think happened is that the 2nd Legion deployed against the Rangdans, and they got tainted by this unknown disease. Their Primarch was tainted too. This is not unheard of for enemies that the Imperium is facing now. The Scions of the Emperor in their novels end up in a tyrannic war. The Tyranids assault their planet and their fortress monastery. Leaving aside the slaughter that followed where the Scions lost and were almost annihilated, all the surviving members were tainted with the Genestealer's kiss from the war, making them crave the control of the hive mind. They pretty much could feel the hive mind in their heads and had to wear psychic hoods to limit its influence, or it would in time overtake them. So the 2nd Legion deploys against the Rangdans. They fight them, but not knowing that the Seraphvors were bringing a taint with them, they ended up infected with it. Now, we don't know what this taint does. It might even be an advanced mind virus that turns what it infects in slaves of the Rangdan. But that doesn't matter. If there was no way to cure them and they were tainted by the Rangdan, there was only one solution: deploy the Space Wolves and purge them too. The 2nd Primarch is the one designated as the Purged. He and the tainted elements of his legion were purged by the Space Wolves, and the surviving members that avoided the taint mind-wiped and sent as additional recruits to the Ultramarines, their legion written down as destroyed against the Rangdans. Now, let's move to what happened to the 11th. Even here we have the claim from Fulgrim that the 11th was always a mystery, and to be honest I had a small idea of what had happened to him, but I wasn't convinced by it until I got direct confirmation of it by none other than Horus himself.
He came to you in a dream or in a lore-filled hallucination?
After Horus was wounded on the moon of the world of Davin by the chaos weapon known as the Caimbre Canatim, the Primarch fell into a coma and to chaos-induced visions of the past and future. He even saw the laboratory where the Primarchs were created, and there he saw the incubation capsule of the 11th Primarch before they were scattered all together through the warp. Horus put his hand on the 11th Primarch capsule and felt something. He stopped by the tank with the 11th stenciled upon it, feeling the untapped glories that might have lain ahead for what grew within, but knowing that they will never come to pass. This was the key, the solution to the mystery. He's not commenting how they will become deleted from Imperial records, how they will become forgotten by humanity, he's commenting on how they will never happen at all. The 11th Primarch, when he was scattered through the warp, landed in the territory of the Rangdan Empire. There he was either slain by the Rangdans in his own gestation pod, or he was taken and made a slave by one of the slave collars the Rangdans used, making him just a mindless drone that went against the Imperium during the second Rangdan Xenocide. But the point is clear, the second Primarch was dead before being reunited with his legion, and the Emperor either found out when he fought the Rangdan in the brutal Xenocides, or he found out when the 11th was killed on the battlefields, in the armies of drone slaves of the Rangdan against the legions. This is why he was forgotten, because he was never reunited with the Imperium in the first place, his legion either going to their deaths against the Rangdans for vengeance for their Gene Father and the anger of the Emperor when he found out, until no man was left, or the few left suffered the same fate of the second, mind-wiped and sent to the Ultramarines as recruits.
But wait, if none of them rebelled, and both died against enemies of the Imperium, why did the Emperor delete them from the records?
Exactly because of that. You have to understand the context the Imperium was in at the time. The second Rangdan Xenocide was catastrophic for the Imperium. The Emperor had to free the Void Dragon and use it against the Rangdans just to assure a bloody survival for mankind and the Imperium. Keep in mind something, Pio. Humanity was on the border of losing against the Rangdans and faced the end, extinction. All the while the Great Crusade was forcing into compliance planet after planet that wanted most often than not nothing to do with the Imperium of Men in general, in war after war that would bring planets either to heal or to complete annihilation. All the while so many forces were expended during the second Rangdan Xenocides that the Imperial military was left thin, weakened. You don't need to kill God to win, you just need to make him bleed and people will stop believing in him. If the news of two of the Imperial legions being tainted or destroyed and their Primarchs killed by the enemies of the Imperium spread to the general Imperium of Men, people will lose faith in the Emperor, the Primarchs and the Imperium of Men, seeing as the perfect demigod generals of the Emperor can be tainted and defeated and killed. How many will rise up in rebellion? How many will find their hope for freedom and independence reinvigorated by such news? Will the Imperium have the forces to quell all the wars that will rise from the ashes of two dead Primarchs? So, he decided to have them deleted from Imperial records. Not only so the Rangdans together with them could die, but so that the shameful truth will never come out, that the Imperium lost two Primarchs and almost two entire legions to an enemy that almost defeated the Emperor of Mankind. Them being deleted was nothing but propaganda to avoid the Imperium fracturing and erupting into rebellion, a rebellion that he didn't have the forces to stop. I think I need rest now. This is what happened to the missing Primarchs. The mystery is solved. See you in the next video. It was decided by Paul on the channel. Thanks for tuning in. Hope you liked the video and my solution to the mystery of the missing Primarchs. Subscribe, and see you next time, guys.
I still haven't gotten paid though.